When I first heard the word Grimdark, I imagined something so utterly bleak. I imagined blood, betrayal, and characters so morally bankrupt that they would make a traditional villain look like a saint. So naturally, I avoided it. But then this year, I started picking up books that were normally considered grimdark. For example, earlier this year, I read Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff, and I just barely finished reading the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. And what I found kind of surprised me, not because they weren't dark, because the books are dark, but people online talking about these books made them sound so much darker than they really are. In fact, rather than being dark, I really found these books to be a lot more human, and accurately so. Grimdark has been used as a sort of shorthand. People have been using the term grimdark to describe worlds where things are tough, characters are morally gray, and the good guys don't necessarily get a happy ending. It's synonymous with nihilism, a world where the heroes aren't heroic, the good guys don't triumph, and everyone just ends up dead. To be fair, the word grimdark comes from something kind of dark. It comes from a tagline from the Warhammer fandom that says, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." But ever since then, grimdark has been used as sort of a tagline and applied to a lot of different things, and it kind of gives you the idea that you should enter at your own risk and you're going to be thrown into something super bloody, murderous, pointlessly evil, and hard for your soul to handle. But I honestly think, now that I've read several books that are in the genre, that it kind of gives it an edginess that these books don't really deserve. Rather than just being evil for evil's sake or shocking to just make you feel really uncomfortable, it really feels human. The stories are doing something a lot more nuanced than you would get from just the quick tagline. I went into the First Law trilogy imagining I was going to be emotionally bludgeoned for 1,800 pages. Instead, I found a cast of deeply relatable characters who were oftentimes not even trying to do the wrong thing, who were just navigating, surviving in a world that was tough. They were definitely not evil for the sake of being evil. They were not wallowing in darkness with maniacal laughter. Most of them were making the best decisions they could with the limited knowledge and power that they had at their disposal. Sometimes they were kind, sometimes they were selfish, sometimes they made decisions that I hated, but I understood them. And that's what makes the story so compelling. It wasn't shock for shock value, but rather putting a mirror to humanity and letting us see what decisions these different, deeply fleshed out characters would make when they were put in different situations. How do people react to systems that are already broken? And how do people react when they only have bad choices put in front of them? What is humanity? And what would we act like in similar situations? And to be fair, a lot of epic fantasy borrows aesthetics from medieval Europe. We have castles, swords, noble houses, horses, war. But some epic fantasies can sometimes forget how brutal this period really was. Battle wasn't clean, medicine was terrifying, and your life expectancy was probably in your 30s. If you were poor, you probably died poor, and if you were rich or a noble, it was likely that someone was trying to poison you. And if we think about it, the stories that they told in the medieval period kind of reflected this. Have you ever actually read some of the original Brother Grimm tales? Forests were full of wolves, women were kidnapped and sometimes eaten, and children turned into soup. So when a modern fantasy story decides to lean into the reality of that historical period, I don't think that that is just grim for being grim. I think that it shows a sort of reality that we've had many times throughout history. And people did have to make some crazy decisions, and those decisions were not always pretty. I would argue or pose that in reality, grimdark is not particularly dark. It's other fantasy subgenres that are lying to us. Most high fantasy stories paint their storytelling and their world with a moral coat of clarity that just hasn't really existed oftentimes in reality. The hero's journey is always righteous, the evil villain is always evil, peasants cheer, and kingdoms are saved. But this framework only kind of works when you ignore the systems that are beneath it. In real history, the hero didn't always win. In fact, oftentimes there wasn't even an indisputable hero, and the evil that you faced was not necessarily a dark lord or something easy to overcome. It might be the crown you served or the people who raised you. So I would argue that it's probably not grimdark that's too bleak. It might be more like some of the other fantasy genres are at times overly hopeful. And grimdark isn't just a medieval European fantasy thing, it definitely goes into other areas of the world as well, and it's a genre that can help us look at and examine things that have happened all over the world, not just the realities of being a peasant in medieval Europe. Take the Poppy War by R.F. Kuang and the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin as examples. These look at grimdark and examine the world through conquest, colonization, and systemic violence. In the Poppy War, there are quite a few dark decisions and there are quite a few dark moments, but I would argue that in this, as well as the ones that are inspired by medieval European fantasy, are not just the decisions are not just created to have a shock value. They have real purpose. It delves into the amount of impossible decisions that people have to make, especially when you're going into war, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. This is grimdark with real historical roots and not just crazy dark fantasy for the sake of shock value. Similarly, the Broken Earth trilogy takes on environmental catastrophes and societal oppression. It shows that survival oftentimes requires brutal decisions and ruthless choices. These stories will show human reactions to real things that have happened and are just, it's a lens that we can see the world through by making it a fantasy story, but they're honestly pretty close to real life. I do hope that some of those examples show that this is not just medieval dark European fantasy, that there are examples that are in other parts of the world as well that also show a depth to humanity. But I want to go into a couple of the series that are most famously known for being grimdark and talk about why I think they're worth reading. The First Law trilogy that I mentioned earlier is known for being peak grimdark, and sure, there's depictions of war and some interesting decisions that are made by some characters. But there's also moments of humor, camaraderie, and positivity. Giselle learning humility, Glaucta's inner voice, even Logan's attempt to not be the Bloody Nine anymore. Then there's the Empire of the Vampire, which is dripping with blood and religious trauma. But it's also a story about grief, love, and faith. The darkness isn't aesthetic. It is the backdrop to something deeply human. And what about A Song of Ice and Fire? Is it grimdark? A lot of people say yes, a lot of people say no, because there is some idea that someone is going to make it to the top and that someone is going to have that happy ending, which excludes it from a lot of people's opinion of being grimdark, but it's still worth mentioning here. George R.R. Martin definitely does not believe in plot armor, and he doesn't believe that people are just going to have the happy ending because it's the right thing for them. People die. Justice isn't guaranteed. And it's not written to be grim, it's written to reflect power. Another thing I think that's worth considering is how modern perspectives shape how we view this grimdark genre. The world is not necessarily better today than it was in medieval periods or in the periods that we're emulating when we go into this grimdark genre of books, but we are able to hide ourselves away from what's happening in the world better than we could before, especially if you come from somewhere that would be considered somewhat of a privileged background. We don't have to see the bloody war when war is not really fought with people anymore, but with advanced weaponry. We can ignore and shield ourselves away from the reality of what it means to be human to some extent and the reality of what happens sometimes because of the way that we currently have society structured. In grimdark stories, characters don't have that luxury. They are forced to constantly look at what's happening and make decisions based off what's best for them in the moment. And while it's easy for us to think that there's always a right answer or always something that is the morally correct thing to do, unless we're oftentimes in that situation, it's hard to know what we would really do and what the average human would really do. While we can shield ourselves in modern society, grimdark strips away that shield and makes us really reckon with the reality of being human and the decisions that people will make for their family, for their tribe, and for themselves. The difference with grimdark stories is not that they glorify darkness or that they just try being dark for the sake of being dark and edgy. It's that they stop pretending like there's always light. They make you sit with the discomfort of power, systems, history, and choice. And sometimes that's exactly the type of story we need. Because life doesn't always come with a clear chosen one. There is not a hero of every story, and sometimes the next best decision for you in your life is just one of survival. So if you've been avoiding grimdark because you think it's especially edgy or over the top or glorifying darkness and there's like a million villains and evil people doing evil little machinations like puppets, I recommend that you actually give the genre a try because it's really not that. It's just a little bit more of a mirror to humanity than you might see in an overly optimistic epic fantasy that does not have grimdark elements. These stories aren't grim just for the sake of being grim. They're complex, they're messy, and they show us what it means to be human and what complicated decisions you might have in your life when not everything works out the exact way that you've expected it to. It's not that grimdark is too dark, it's just that the rest of fantasy sometimes is a little too optimistic. Let me know if you like grimdark or what you think of the grimdark genre. I know that this was kind of like a little bit of a take, a little bit of a video essay that simplifies it a little bit. There could be some books out there that are indeed darker than they need to be. But the purpose of this is to really just convince people to read books that they might have otherwise been scared to read because they think they're darker than they actually are. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, and hopefully I'll see you in another video soon. Thank you.